No cowboy kept the bride born with only 4 toes. A widowed judge did. The deed to the Canfield place was on my desk when I heard about her. Not the story, just a word from Harlan Pruitt, who ran the feed store and couldn't keep his mouth shut about anything from Laramie to the Nevada line. He said a woman had come in on the morning stage, sat down in the hotel dining room, ordered eggs and black coffee, and hadn't moved since. Said she was supposed to get married 2 days prior up in Cheyenne. Said the groom looked at her foot, her left foot, the one she'd been born with, the one that had 4 toes instead of 5, and said he couldn't do it. Harlan told me this like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all year. I didn't say anything, just looked back down at the deed. But I kept thinking about that woman sitting in the dining room. Ordered eggs, didn't move. That's not a woman who's fallen apart. That's a woman deciding something. I'm going to tell you how I know that, and why it matters, and how she ended up being the best thing that ever walked into my life at an age when most men have already stopped expecting good things to walk anywhere near them. My name is Harlan Cade. I was 62 years old when this happened. I've been a circuit judge for the territory of Wyoming for 11 years, which meant I spent most of my life on horseback or in a rented room, and the rest of it at a bench in one of 4 courtrooms that served an area roughly the size of Portugal. I knew the law. I knew cattle disputes and water rights and claim jumpers and the particular cruelty of men who believed the frontier excused them from decency. I'd been married once to a woman named Ruth who died of a fever in the winter of 1878. We had no children. I'd gone on working because there wasn't anything else, and because work is a kind of answer to grief, even if it's not a very good one. I was not a handsome man. Never had been. I had a jaw like a railroad tie and hands that had been broken enough times they didn't close all the way flat. I wore a black coat and a hat that had seen better years, and I rode a gray gelding named Probably, because when I bought him, the man selling him said he'd probably be fine for trail work, and I'd never been able to improve on the name. I had good eyes, and I could read a man's character about as fast as most people read a sentence, and I had never once in 62 years backed down from something I knew to be right. That's the whole inventory. That's what I was walking around with. The woman in the dining room was named Cecilia Marsh. I didn't go meet her that day or the next. It wasn't my business. She was a stranger in a hard spot, and the kindest thing I could do was leave her alone while she figured out what she was going to do. What I did was finish the deed work, ride out to the Canfield place to settle a boundary question, come back 2 days later, and eat supper at the hotel because I always ate supper at the hotel when I was in Morrow Creek, which was the town, and that's where I finally saw her. She was sitting alone at a table by the window. She had brown hair pinned up but not elaborately, brown eyes, a good straight back. She was maybe 35, 36. She was reading. Not a Bible, not a ladies' magazine. She had a copy of Blackstone's Commentaries, which is a book about the common law of England, and she had it open flat on the table beside her plate, and she was reading it the way some people read novels, all the way in, not looking up. I sat down at my usual table. Mrs. Pfeiffer, who owned the hotel, brought me my supper. She leaned in and whispered, "That's the woman from Cheyenne," as if I didn't know that, as if the whole town hadn't been talking about nothing else for 4 days. I said I knew. She whispered, "Harlan Pruitt says she's got." I said, "Mrs. Pfeiffer, I don't have any interest in what Harlan Pruitt says." She straightened up and went away, and I ate my beef stew, and I did not look at Cecilia Marsh again that evening. Except once. She turned a page of Blackstone, and she must have felt my eyes because she looked up, and I looked away, and then, because I was 62 years old and I had stopped being embarrassed about being caught doing something honest, I looked back. She held the look for a moment. Then she went back to her book. That was the whole of it that night. The next morning I was at the courthouse, which in Morrow Creek meant a room above the land office with a table and 6 chairs. I had 2 matters to hear before noon. The first was a claim dispute I settled in about 20 minutes. The second was a question about a will, and the woman contesting the will was one Mrs. Adeline Pruitt, Harlan's wife, which told me everything I needed to know about the morning I was about to have. I was reading through the documents when the door opened, and Cecilia Marsh came in. She had her Blackstone with her. She stood at the door and said, "I was told this is where the circuit judge sits." I said it was. She said, "I'd like to observe if that's permissible." I said it was a public proceeding. She was welcome to sit. She sat in the back. She didn't take out her book. She watched the whole Pruitt matter, which went on for about an hour and a half, and involved more family animosity than I generally like to see before noon. I ruled for Mrs. Pruitt's nephew, which was correct, and which was also going to make Harlan Pruitt even less able to control his mouth around town, but I'd given up worrying about that years ago. After I dismissed the matter and the room cleared out, Cecilia Marsh was still sitting there. I said, "Is there something you wanted to ask?" She said, "You cited Garfield v. Heaton in 1874. I've been reading Blackstone trying to understand property law. I didn't know about that case." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "Why are you reading Blackstone?" She said, "Because I've decided I'm going to become a lawyer." I said, "There are about 12 women lawyers in the whole country." She said, 13 when I'm done. She didn't say it's smart. She didn't say it to show off. She said it the way you say something you've already decided so completely that the arguing about it is in the past. I had talked to a lot of people in courtrooms over the years, and I knew the difference between someone performing conviction and someone who had it down to the bone. I said, "Garfield v. Heaton isn't in Blackstone. It's in the Wyoming Territorial Records. I have copies." She looked at me steadily. "I'd appreciate seeing them." So that was how it started, not the way things usually start. Not over a meal or a dance or an introduction at somebody's parlor. Over a property case from 1874 and a woman who had decided she was going to do something that almost no one thought was possible. I let her read the case files. Then she had questions and I answered them, and she had more questions, and the questions were good ones, the kind you only ask if you've been thinking hard about something instead of just reading the surface of it. We met in the courthouse room the next morning and the morning after that. Mrs. Pfeiffer noticed and started giving me looks at supper. Harlan Pruitt naturally had opinions. I didn't care about any of that. What I cared about was that this woman thought clearly and read carefully and didn't waste words, and she had been treated badly by someone who should have known better, and she had turned that into fuel instead of ash, and something about that made me feel, I don't know how to say this without it sounding like less than it was, awake. In a way I hadn't been in a long time. I want to be plain about something. I was not under any illusion that this woman had any interest in me beyond the law books. She was 35 and I was 62, and she had just come from a failed engagement, and the sensible thing, the thing any reasonable man would have told himself, was that this was a professional arrangement, nothing more. She needed information I had. I was glad to give it. That was all. I told myself that for about 3 weeks. Then one evening she was reading through a mineral rights dispute I'd brought her to look at, because she had a good eye for the kind of technical language that hides dishonesty in legal documents. And she found something, a clause buried in the third schedule, the kind of thing you'd have to read 4 times to see, and she looked up and she was smiling, just barely, the particular smile of someone who has caught something trying to hide from them, and I thought, God, she is something. I didn't say it, I went back to my own papers. But I thought it, and I knew what it meant, and I spent the better part of that night telling myself everything sensible I've already listed for you and a few things besides. Her age and mine. The difference. What she'd been through. The fact that she'd come here to become a lawyer, not to find a man, and she'd been clear about that. The fact that a woman like that, with that mind and that backbone, was not going to look at a worn-out circuit judge on the far side of 60 and see anything except a useful library. All of that was true and reasonable, and I had myself mostly convinced by morning. Then I walked into the courthouse room, and she was already there, and she had made coffee on the small stove in the corner. She'd apparently asked Mrs. Pfeiffer where to find the coffee, and she handed me a cup without saying anything and went back to her chair, and that was the end of my sensible argument. I need to tell you about the 4th toe. I know that sounds strange, but this is part of the story and it matters. I never brought it up. It wasn't my place to bring it up. About 5 weeks in, she brought it up herself. We'd been talking about something, a fraud case, I think, something to do with forged cattle brands, and she stopped mid-sentence and said, "You've never asked about my foot." I said I hadn't. She said, "Everyone asks." I said, "It's not my business." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Chester, that was the man in Cheyenne. He held my hand at the altar. He was fine. And then we went to walk out, and I had the train of the dress lifted up so I wouldn't trip on the steps, and he looked down and he could see through my stocking that the littlest toe was that there wasn't one. And he just..." She stopped. He stepped back. Right there in front of everyone. He said he couldn't do it. He said he should have been told. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, he was a coward and a fool, and you were lucky. She said, I know that. It took me about 48 hours, but I know that. I said, for what it's worth. I've spent 20 years watching men decide what a person is worth based on the wrong things. A man who marries you is getting everything you are. Anyone who can't see what that is from 20 feet away doesn't deserve to be standing at the altar with you. She didn't say anything for a little while. Then she said, that's the most words you've said at one time. I said I was making up for lost time. She almost laughed, not quite, but almost. And something between us settled. The way a room settles after a door has been open too long, and you finally get it closed against the wind. I was in Morrow Creek for 2 more weeks before my schedule took me south to Ridgeline for the fall term. We worked every morning. She'd gotten hold of more case records. She'd written to a clerk in Cheyenne she'd found a reference to, and she was building something methodically the way you build a real argument. She knew what she was doing. I told her that. She said she'd had a good teacher, which I thought might be the nicest thing anyone had said to me in years, which tells you something about my years. The last evening before I left, we had supper together at the hotel, which had by then become normal, which meant that Mrs. Pfeiffer no longer even tried to hide her interest in it. After, we walked out onto the porch, which faced west, and there was a long, flat pink light across the plain that you only get in September, and we stood there in it for a while. She said, how long will you be in Ridgeline? I said 6 weeks, then back up through here heading north. She said, I'll be here. I looked at her. She said, I've taken a room, month to month. I'm going to keep at the case files until I know them. A pause. Mrs. Pfeiffer has given me use of the stove in exchange for help with the books, which, as it turns out, I am better at than she expected. I said, you're going to stay. She said, I have nowhere else to be, and this is where the work is. Then she looked at me directly, the way she did when she was about to say something she'd already decided, and she said, and this is where you come back to. I didn't answer right away. The light was doing something extraordinary to the plain, all that flat grass going gold and then dark at the edges. I said, Cecilia. She said, don't be foolish, Harlan. I'm not foolish, and neither are you, and we've been having the same conversation without saying it for 6 weeks. I said, you're 35 years old. She said, I know how old I am. I said, I'm 62. She said, I know how old you are too. A pause. Is there something wrong with you that I've missed? Something beyond the age. I thought about it honestly. I said, I'm gone more than I'm here. I've got a bad knee and a horse named Probably. I've been alone for 8 years, and I've gotten set in my ways in about 40 directions. She said, I've read enough law to know that none of those are bars. I said, Cecilia. She said, Harlan, and she stepped forward and put her hand on my arm, just above the elbow, her fingers through the wool of my coat, and she looked at me straight. I have been proposed to by 3 men, and I left all 3 of them for reasons. The last one left me for a reason that tells you exactly how much he was worth. I have been reading your mind every morning for 6 weeks, and I know what's in it. So does every person in this town. I am asking you to stop being careful and start being honest. The plain had gone almost dark. There were lights coming on in the houses down the street. Somewhere a horse was moving in a corral, that particular sound of hooves on packed dirt. I put my hand over hers on my arm. I said, I'll be back in 6 weeks. She said, I know you will. That was all. She went inside. I stood on the porch for another while, looking at the dark coming up across the flats, and I felt, I don't have a better word for it, full. Like something that had been empty for a long time had weight in it again. I went to Ridgeline. 6 weeks. A long land fraud case that took 3 weeks to untangle, a murder that took 1 day, and 2 boundary disputes that should have been 1. Probably threw a shoe in the 2nd week, and I spent a day in a town called Dry Camp waiting for the farrier, which gave me a lot of time to think. I thought about Ruth, who I would always think about, and who I believed would not begrudge me this, because she was not that kind of person. I thought about what it meant that Cecilia had said what she said plainly, and without flinching, without the performance of it, just 2 people on a porch in September light. I thought about how long it had been since anyone had wanted me to stop being careful and start being honest. I thought about that more than anything else. I wrote her twice from Ridgeline. 1 letter about a case she'd asked me to look up a reference for. 1 letter that wasn't about law at all. She wrote me back 3 times. 2 about law, 1 that wasn't. I won't tell you what was in that one. Some things are yours. I came back to Morrow Creek on a Tuesday in November. It was cold. The kind of cold where the air has an edge to it, and the sky is white all the way down to the ground, and your breath comes out in a cloud every time, and you stop noticing it after a while because there's too much else to notice. I put probably in the livery, and I walked to the hotel, and she was not in the dining room. Mrs. Pfeiffer told me she was at the courthouse. Of course she was. She was always at the courthouse. She'd been given a key to the land office on the basis that she was keeping better records than anyone had in years. And I walked over there, and I could see the light in the upstairs window. I went up. She was at the table with the case files spread in front of her, and a lamp on her left side, and the small stove going in the corner. She looked up when I came in, and for a moment neither of us said anything, because there are moments where talking is less than the moment, and this was one of them. Then she said, "You're 2 days earlier than I expected." I said, "The fraud case resolved. One of the parties confessed." She said, "Which one?" I said, "The one you'd have picked." She almost smiled. Then she stood up and she came around the table, and she did something I hadn't expected. She put her arms around me. Not the way you do for ceremony. The way you do when you've been waiting and you're done waiting. Her head against my chest and her arms around my coat, and she held on. I put my arms around her. I held on too. She said against my coat, "I got a letter from a law clerk in Cheyenne. There's a firm there that's taken on a woman as a junior reader. She sits the bar exam in February." I said, "Only 12 in the country." She said, "11 when I do." We stood there a while in the lamplight with the stove putting out its small heat, and the cold pressing against the window, and neither of us in any hurry to be anywhere else. I said, "I'm going to ask you something." She said, "Yes." I said, "I haven't asked yet." She said, "I know what you're going to ask." I pulled back enough to look at her. She was looking at me the way she looked at a legal argument she'd decided was sound, clear-eyed, certain, already past the point of debate. I said, "Cecilia Marsh. I am 62 years old, and I spend most of my life in a saddle or a rented room, and I have a bad knee and a horse with a questionable name, and I am asking you to marry me." She said, "Yes." Just that, not dressed up, not performed, yes. I said, "You know what people will say." She said, "Harlan, I am the woman who got left at the altar over a toe. I have been the subject of this town's conversation for 3 months. I have no more interest in what people say." I said, "Fair enough." She said, "Besides, they already think we're married. Mrs. Pfeiffer has been telling people since October." I laughed. I hadn't laughed like that in a long time, the real kind. The kind that comes up from somewhere low and surprises you. And it felt strange and good, like a door opening in a house you thought had all its doors stuck. We were married in December. The courthouse room. Judge Alderman from Ridgeline came to preside, which he thought was enormously funny, a judge being married by a judge. Mrs. Pfeiffer was there. The land office clerk, young man named Tomas, was there. Harlan Prout was not invited. The ceremony took 12 minutes. Cecilia wore a blue dress she'd made herself, which was better than anything she could have bought in Morrow Creek. I wore my black coat, which she had brushed and pressed the night before, and hung on the door like it was waiting for its instructions. Afterward, in the cold outside, Mrs. Pfeiffer cried. Tomas shook my hand for a long time. Alderman said something about it being about time, which I chose to take as a compliment. We walked back to the hotel, which was ours for another 3 weeks before I had to ride the spring circuit. The sky was the kind of clear you only get in Wyoming in December, everything sharp-edged, the mountains white above the brown plain, and the cold coming off the ground so clean it almost had a sound to it. Cecilia had her hand in the crook of my arm. She was looking at the mountains. She said, "Next February." I said, "The bar exam." She said, "I'll need you to vouch for me, with the clerk, for the character requirement." I said, "I can do that." She said, "You know it's irregular. A judge vouching for his own wife." I said, "Most of what you do is irregular." She looked at me sidelong, that almost smile again. Then she leaned into my arm a little more, and we walked on toward the hotel. And the mountains were white, and the sky was hard blue, and the ground was frozen under us. And I was 62 years old, and I had a good woman beside me who had chosen me with her eyes open, who had looked at what I was and said yes to every bit of it. And I want to tell you, any man who's carried the quiet weight of not being chosen, of being looked past. of getting to an age where you stop expecting anyone to see you plain. I want to tell you that there is nothing in this world like the feeling of being chosen anyway. Not because you changed, not because you performed something, because she looked at what was there and she said, yes, that's the one. That's enough, that's more than enough, that's everything. Cecilia passed the bar in February of the following year. She was the 12th woman licensed to practice law in the United States. We put the letter on the wall of the courthouse room, which had become hers as much as mine by then. I rode my circuits and came back to her. She built her practice slowly, the way you build anything real. She had a particular gift for the cases nobody wanted. The ones where somebody had been taken advantage of because they didn't know the words, because they were a woman or a newcomer or a man who'd been too trusting, and they'd signed something they shouldn't have, and now they were losing the thing they'd worked for. She never lost her copy of Blackstone. It lived on the courthouse table. The spine had been cracked and re-glued twice. She put a piece of string in it at the case she'd been reading the night I first came in, and the string stayed there. I asked her about it once, years later. She said, that's where it starts. I'm going to tell you the last thing, and then I'm done. About 4 years in, we had a young couple come through Morrow Creek. They were newly married or about to be. The man was older, not as old as me, maybe 45, and the woman was young and had some kind of limp. I don't remember what, something she'd been born with, and some of the town had been giving them looks. The man came to me. I don't know why exactly, maybe because I was a judge and he thought I'd have something official to say about it. He said, people have been talking. I said, people will always talk. He said, she was left before. Her first engagement. The man decided he didn't want her. I looked at him, good man, worried eyes but steady underneath. I said, what did you decide? He said, I decided she's the best thing I ever found. I said, then that's the answer to everything people are saying. He looked at me for a moment, then he nodded and went out. I turned around and Cecilia was in the doorway. She'd heard it. She was looking at me with that look, the clear-eyed, decided look, and she said, that was nicely done. I said I had a good example. She came over and stood beside me at the window. Outside, the young man was walking back to the hotel, and the plain was spread out past the edge of town, all that dry grass going silver in the afternoon light. Her hand found mine. We stood there and watched the light change. That's all, that's the whole of it,